Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It feels like it's been a while since we had a book chat. Book Chats has been on a bit of a hiatus this semester, but we're really excited to host several of our colleagues this month. I just wanted to mention a few of the book chats we're doing this month. So next week, April 9th, Lizel Yamaguchi will discuss her new book on the color of vowels, Thinking Through Synesthesia, with Eric Falchi, chair of the English department. We'll also be hosting discussions of Faye Mayen Ang's new memoir, Orphan Bachelors, and Alva Noe's The Entanglement later this month. Also, next Tuesday, April 8th, the Art of Writing program will host its annual Rogan Lecture with the computer scientist and author Jaron Lanier. That event will take place over in the English department in the Mod 5 room at 5, so go to our website and register for the event. So today we're very pleased to welcome Francine Masiello, Professor Emerita in the Departments of Comparative Literature in Spanish and Portuguese, to discuss her new novel, The Tomb of the Divers. Joining Francine is her colleague from Comparative Literature, Vicky Kahn, who's also the Catherine Bixby Hotchkiss Chair in English. So Francine and Vicky, we're really looking forward to your conversation. So I'll hand the mic to you.
So welcome everyone. It's really great to be at this Francine Fest to celebrate her novel, The Tomb of the Divers. So I thought what I'd do is just briefly describe the novel, and then we'll get the conversation started with Francine. So the novel tells the story of an extended family from a village in the south of Italy, one of whom marries into the Neapolitan aristocracy, and several of whom moved from Italy to New York and New Jersey. One of the characters falls into anarchist circles and eventually ends up in Buenos Aires during the dirty war of the 1980s. The novel is full of fantastic detail about newspapers and journals and outdoor theater at the turn of the century in New York, about the international world of art forgery, about Gorky and Lenin on Capri in the 1910s, about Naples in 1944, including the Jewish deportations. There's a painter figure named Silvio who can imitate the great Renaissance paintings of Gentileschi and Carracci, and whose work is then appropriated by crooks and art forgers. There are a number of unspoken gay relationships, and there's the relationship between the two sibling narrators, a woman and a man living in 1980s New York, who quarrel specifically about who has the right to narrate the story and who has the talent. Okay, so Francine, in the author's note at the end of the novel, you characterize the novel as a work of historical fiction. Do you want to say something about this description?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that summary. It sounds so chaotic. I think I should have not even me. I should have been short. But in any event, I have always suffered from archive fever, usually as a Latin Americanist, and I needed to do something in my dotage, which was to move over into Italian studies, because really this is quite foreign to me. And I wanted to process this 100-year period. It sounds very Garcia Marquez. This is not 100 years of solitude, but 100 years of confusion. But in any event, what I wanted to put together was history with fictional characters. And I sort of had in the back of my head the ragtime. Remember Houdini and Mr. Ford are speaking to these invented characters. And also a film that I admired many years ago, the Mexican film Y tu mamá también, where the two teenage boys are courting an older woman, and in the background, all of the history of the Mexican military and disappearances and other current events in Mexico go on as these two kids are organizing their lives. So that was sort of how I thought about the relationship of history and fiction. And the other thing is that all of these characters really don't get a chance at history, right? They're on the margins at all moments, and they're not changing history at all. You may have another take on this, Vicky, but in any event, I wanted to speak about people who didn't quite have a voice in official terms. And I wanted to talk about loners and artists, and it turned somehow into crooks as well. Crooks, thieves, forgers, this and that. And there's and also gay characters on the margins of these so-called family romances where gay characters are never acknowledged. So the period I chose, and you tell me to stop, this could go on forever. I began with the late 19th century, and I went up to the dirty war in Argentina in 1978 to 83, 85. I'm getting my dates wrong, 16. And in any event, what I wanted to start is, so it's not scenes of abjection. Like, there's so much on Italian literature about abject characters, people starving, hunger, misery, right? And therefore they have to come to America. And maybe this was another cut, maybe kind of a Gramscian intellectual allied with priests and people who were literate. That my cut was to start in the late 19th century. And the key moment there is the murder of the King of Italy. And this happens, this sort of kicks off the novel. Well, actually, it kicks off chapter 2, but it's the sort of background for what happens in chapter 1. And I wanted to move along key moments about which I knew nothing. Remember, I'm not an Italianist, and I had to figure out how this worked. And I got my characters from chapter 1 in Italy, where my main female character meets a marquis who sweeps her off to Naples. And then chapter 2, and there I had class differences that were very marked, and the character having to learn French in order to order food in the house of the nobles. And then chapter 2 was focused on a topic that was very important to me, which was anarchism. I don't come from an anarchist family, a communist family, a socialist family. I come from a family that wanted to climb up the greasy pole, and therefore not exactly politically relevant, let us say, for the kinds of interests that I have. So I studied anarchism in New Jersey, around the silk mills of Paterson, New Jersey, and I developed my character encountering and having as his roommate the man who murdered the King of Italy. Bresci was an anarchist who wound up in Paterson and went back to Italy to avenge the murders that he saw in Milan. So I put these two characters together, and thus my anarchist character took life, but he was never a committed anarchist at all. And then I leapt ahead to World War II, and this is about the late first 20 years of my character, my anarchist characters in New York, and then I moved ahead to the 1930s. And this was a mixture of World War II, no battle scenes or anything like that, but I wanted to talk about the Jewish deportations. I had seen a wonderful, like all of you, were up at night, in the middle of the night, looking at tapes for reasons beyond my true understanding, but the Yale Holocaust Archive has extraordinary videos of Jews who wound up in the south of Italy during the war, or after 1938. And I was very taken by one man, Hans Heimann. Marion and I watched the tape, wept, oh my God, Hans Heimann, what a great man. And I situated him in this little town, right, where he establishes a relationship not only with the priest, but also with my character, Silvio, who is the art forger. And this pushes ahead. They all wind up, some of them wind up in Buenos Aires, because they can't stand to be in Italy any longer. And my anarchist character is in Buenos Aires because he's basically being deported by J. Edgar Hoover. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the historical schema. And then there's Argentina, starting in the 1920s, which I know very, very well. And I moved it up to the narrators searching to establish a family history. And that takes place in the 1980s. So there's a lot of movement because I wanted characters to have a lot of movement. The immigrant story is someone sitting at the kitchen table talking to other relatives. And there's very little kitchen table. Well, there is some, but there's not a lot. All of these characters are moving, and all of these characters are trying to figure out what their story is. So should I keep? I'll stop there.
Stop there. So this would be a great time to talk about the title of the novel and the cover image.
Okay, here we go. Oh, here it is. Again, the Tomb of the Diver, singular, refers to a sarcophagus drawing in Paestum, but back a little bit. The Greeks were in the south of Italy, Magna Graecia, and in Paestum, which is south of the Amalfi Coast, south of Salerno, about an hour south of that, in Paestum, they found in 1968 the best surviving example of a Greek sarcophagus. And on the top lid is this image of a young boy diving into the water, and it's ambiguous. Is he diving to his death, or is it a rebirth? You do what you want. And this is a very famous image. It's in all the art books. But what's not quite as well known is that on the lid, this would be the lid, the image would be on the lid of the sarcophagus. On the interior walls of the sarcophagus are scenes of a young boy being tutored by his teachers, eros pedagogos, if you want, no? I mean, and they're homoerotic scenes. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting. We know this image, but we don't know what lies beyond. And I thought that was, for me, that was important because I wanted to have the submerged story next to the famous image. And that underneath this celebrated image, we had another realm of experience that never really made it into the art history books. And it did, but not, this is the image that people hold on to. So, and that made, Marianne and I were in Paestum many years ago. I said, oh my God, this is great. And it always stayed in my head. And I thought, this motivated me for the title. It's a stealing, because with all these characters stealing everything, artworks, novels, this and that. I also am a thief. But I made it plural because all of these characters in this novel are in some way related to water. Crossing the ocean, drowning in the ocean, everything is somehow water, and the fluidity of the narrative is moving throughout. So does that explain it?
Yeah, and it seems like also the homoerotic dimension of the scenes underneath is also relevant to the novel insofar as there are depictions of gay relationships that are kind of unspoken in the community, but very beautifully portrayed by you.
Yeah, well, I was thinking of how this works in little towns where there's a common knowledge, but no one says anything, right? Everything is there, but it's not spoken. And throughout the novel, this happens. Eugenia, who is my main character who winds up marrying a marquis who really wants a marriage of convenience because he's a gay man, and they love each other. I think I wanted the two characters to care about one another. This was not an abusive relationship at all, but each had a separate life. Carmelo, who is the sibling of Eugenia, who goes to New York, links up with the anarchists, and he lives in the world of the copy. He can't find his own voice. He was Bresci's roommate, and for years he pursues the girlfriend of Bresci because he figures that he can be as important as Bresci by courting his girl. And then I made I tried to invent the erotic scenes were not so great, I need to say. But in any event, the two make love, and it's a good scene. No, it is. I've found my scene. Anyway, and at the end, I put, and that night, my character Carmelo dreamed that he was in the arms of Bresci. I mean, okay, and I will, and so it goes until Silvio, the artist, the art forger, has a relationship with the Jewish refugee in the south of Italy, and they care about each other deeply, but Silvio is under the thumb of his art agent, Eugenia, and it never materializes, and eventually he moves to Argentina. There is a fruitful relationship. I should be telling the whole novel, right? Now, okay, let us say there is a fruitful gay relationship in this novel, and it brings the novel to an end. But I wanted to work through the suggestions, yes, no, maybe, yes, no, where there wasn't violence, but there was a lot of self-protecting. Anyway, did I make?
Good. So this maybe brings us back to the first question I asked you about historical fiction. But I wanted to know whether you wanted to talk about the theoretical issues that came up when you were writing a family history that was also fictional. And I should mention here, for people who haven't read the novel, that there's an appendix and a bibliography in this novel. I
couldn't help myself. I couldn't get rid of it.
There's a lot of research in this novel, and you mentioned Gramsci and you mentioned other theoretical figures. So how did you think about integrating not only the research, but the theoretical paradigms that had influenced you with the writing of fiction?
This is very hard, as all of us know. It's very hard to go from academic writing to this, and you try to shake it off, but it's always there. And I must say, this originally was a manuscript that was 540 pages long, and I got it down to 300 pages. So you can imagine how much stuff was there. I don't think it's a good idea to write fiction from theory, but you carry it around, kind of like a snail carries around its back, let us say. And what was particularly important for me was the question of the relationship between the original and the copy, which all of us in postmodern studies know inside and out. But that was crossing, and therefore, because of this tension between the original and the copy, I had the characters stealing each other's manuscripts, forging artworks, passing things off that didn't belong to them as someone else's, ventriloquizing, and I was playing with it a lot. I even have a joke page, which maybe I should read to you later, which are stolen jokes that I stole, which maybe Tony Cascardi knows as well, I'm sure. But in any event, the other thing that's important in this convergence is the origin story. And we are so certain, aren't we, of our origins. And someone sits down at the table and says, I'll tell you about your great-grandmother and your great-grandfather. Or in the case of my Italian-American compatriots, they'll say, we came to America and we worked hard. We came and we had documents. You get the subtext, right? Okay, well, is this a real story? Or are we inventing it? So I tried to work through that on terms of the tensions between the original and the spin-offs. Now, so it's a novel. I wanted it to be a novel about supplementary information, that the stories kept spinning larger and larger, and no one was certain in the end what this is about. And I have letter writers. I think I said before, I thought I took from real life a story of my mother. I'll tell the story and then I'll tell you my discovery. I had in my head, my family they were active correspondents forever, back and forth. And a letter that arrived from Italy was kind of a momentous, almost solemn occasion, because they would read the letter, they would comment on it, They would read it again. They would look for details. They would comment on this letter versus the letter that had arrived 2 weeks ago. Is this right? Is this right? And I actually thought, and I said in public, my mother was the great commentator of the letters, the one who was explicating the text. And I realized, my mother didn't know Italian. How the hell could she have done that? Anyway, a lot of things that I was beginning to take as certainties in my life story fell apart. They just peeled off. But and this was happening to the characters as well, no? And so there's a lot of tension in this fiction about the original and the copy and its deformations, or the distortions that make characters change their course in life. So where is the theoretical material? We know that there's a lot of theoretical material behind this, but no, that was not in the author's note. There was no Deleuze in the author's note, none of that. I was actually interested in the author's note because I really, as I said to Mia about 2 years ago when it was 540 pages long, I said, this makes me an Italian major. I get a certificate from this. My bibliography, I'm looking for my author's note. I want to show you guys. Anyway, and my author's note, which I wrote in about 2 hours, this was the easiest part of this novel, was the bibliography. It was the historical bibliography, and it was showing off, let's face it. Right? But in any event, what was the spin-off on this were derivations and derivations that I had a lot of fun with, but I was still questioning the idea of an original immigrant story, which everyone in the room has, right? And which everyone in the room knows is not true, right? But anyway.
So I was going to ask you about the original and the copy, but you've already answered that. But I thought, so Silvio is the artist who gets kind of induced into the act of art forgery. But he also disappears in the novel. And so I'm wondering if you want to read a little bit from this section in the novel on page 279 and 80.
Okay, thank you for your directives. Okay, one thing to say, I'll say 2 things here about 279 and 280. I had Silvio, who appears in chapter 1 as the best friend of the little girl who will later marry the Marquis. And he's a talented artist, self-trained. And during the Second World War, he becomes an art forger of note. And there's a tremendous discussion about these back and forths. And he winds up in Argentina. And he becomes a disappeared person. And this is very delicate for me because I didn't want to turn the Argentine tragedy into the kitsch of my novel, right? I mean, it's very hard to write about this, but I needed, because this book is called The Tomb of the Divers, I needed Silvio to wind up there. And among other things, in this novel, my narrator, Rosanna, goes to Argentina trying to write her dissertation, and winds up continuing her research for her novel. And she wants information about Silvio, whom she knows wound up in Argentina. And she finds a young woman who's an art forger who had been a great friend of Silvio. And I tried to practice something that I learned from many Argentine novelists, and that's he said that structure, which is a very bizarre structure in terms of discursive interventions, right? Because we don't know if it's true, right? If I say, yesterday, the chancellor said that, we don't know whether to trust me, right? Okay, and there's a whole question of that. In any event, my character Rosanna finds Kati, the artist, and wants information about Silvio. And this goes on for a good 30 pages. And this is the end of the story. And I want to read it because I'm thinking about what's going on today. And I certainly was not thinking of that when I wrote this. Katy spoke to Paulina and Rosanna in somber tones. Silvio finally, I have to give you one more piece of background. I realize I'm about to read this and you need something. Silvio and Katy in the 1970s were recruited by the Argentine armed left to develop a series of forgeries that they could sell to the generals. This is sort of based on something that I observed in Argentina. The first time I went to Argentina was in 1978, in the middle of the dictatorship. And across the street from where I was staying, a bomb went off. Everything shook. The whole block was shaking. And the story was that a young high school girl went to visit the daughter of a general and tried to pass off manuscripts. And then, of course, it was a way to get into the building. Everybody else came in the building. They blew up the building. So I'm stealing this narrative a little bit. Silvio and Katy were invited, almost obliged, to make a series of forgeries that they could sell to the generals in their home. Okay, so here goes. Katy spoke to Paulina and Rosanna in somber tones. Silvio finally agreed to help out the resistance group. For several months, he and I painted up a storm in the name of an unnamed struggle. I worked on a painting by Sul Solar. Silvio worked on a Caravaggio. Silvio even produced a few extra paintings and then donated those canvases that he'd carried from Italy. In short, we assembled a respectable collection to send in the name of war. The poet-journalist comrades were very grateful. We took a deep breath and felt relief at having reached closure. Then, promising each other that we'd never mention the topic again, that we'd never speak of forgery, we opened a good Malbec. Rosanna and Paulina were bothered by so much talk, giving each other knowing glances. They hoped that Katy would trim down her story. "This story doesn't end well," Katy said with downcast eyes. "Something must have gone wrong. I never knew how it came to be." Katy got up and walked around the room several times before taking her seat, one leg tucked under her thigh. "Silvio disappeared," she said, checking to make sure that Rosanna knew what the phrase meant in modern Argentine life. Rosanna nodded. "One day, the police went looking for me at my apartment in Villa Crespo," Katy said. "No one knew of my whereabouts out here in the Isla. This was my saving grace. But my address in Buenos Aires was more or less common knowledge. In any case, I was off visiting my cousin when Silvio, who was staying at my apartment, answered a knock at the door. The police were looking for me, since for better or worse, I had an aggrandized reputation in the world of copies and fakes. Silvio probably protected my name. God knows what else he said, but the police ransacked my apartment and then took Silvio away. We never saw him again. I'm still awash in grief," she said to her friends after a pause. "Imagine the police taking a man of his age. God knows what they did. I don't want to believe that they killed him by dropping him into the sea, but their cruelty knows no limits. He was so very fragile." Paulina and Rosanna heard the leaves rustling on the trees, the rush of the delta's water, the howling wind. This was not the moment to speak. "It wasn't supposed to end this way," Rosanna finally said. Rosanna was weeping quietly while Paulina clutched her arm. Katy interrupted. "If I'd had any doubts about the unnatural workings of a country where rule of law had been suspended, in that moment, I came face to face with its emotional truth, the bare bones of living."
So Francine, I think we should stop there. So there's time for questions.
Okay, thank you.
The rest of this page is also really terrific, and I wish we could read it, but I feel that my duty is to now open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Oh.
And if you could wait to begin your question until you have the mic, that would be great.
Okay. So thank you both for this. It's wonderful always to hear you talk about your work, Francine, especially to talk about a novel. Novel that you've written. Over the years, you've talked about with me and other people on many occasions how novelists don't know how to end a story. That's a problem with almost all novels. And so without giving us the ending to your story, could you talk a little bit about how you faced that challenge and lessons you learned along the way in a career of reading?
Thank you. I wanted this to be ambiguous. I didn't want a clean ending. My model maybe was the television series The Sopranos. Just let the screen go black. And Rosanna finishes. I didn't really write with a storyboard. I know that the proper novelist should have a clear sense of direction. I knew how I wanted to start. I knew about the time span. I knew that I wanted underdog characters or characters who, as I said before, stood outside of history. And I knew that I wanted an ending that whatever it would be ambiguous. In other words, the good reader knows what happened. So Rosanna in this novel tries to claim her writing as her own, and her brother keeps undermining her. Should I tell the end? No, I shouldn't tell the end. Anyway, I struggled. I had a back and forth with this. Originally, I should say, I had the narrators, the siblings, in footnotes. And the editor said, you can't put the characters in footnotes to that extent. And I said, why not? Everyone in Latin America does it. Why can't I? Anyway, the characters moved up to the main part of the text against my goodwill. And I have a coda at the end, which belongs to the brother. That's all I'll say. And I did map it. I did map that out. I wanted it to end like that. Okay, but I won't say anymore.
Francine, I wonder if you could talk a bit about your experience in developing characters, and maybe developing is not the best word for this, but I'm struck by struck by imagining you writing this and your experience in forming characters and what it was like to give them some kind of stability, given the fact that you're making them up and all the time, and maybe along with that, how you dealt with the need to have different voices in the text, which is a very different thing from writing academic prose.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a great question, Tony, because the character in fiction is the most difficult to explain. And we know as teachers, how do you explain a character to your students? This is text on a page, and all of a sudden the characters take life. And I kept thinking, I can't be telling backstory. I need to have the characters talking. I need an adventure for these characters. And I kept going to the backstory because I wanted my author's notes and my bibliography to show up. But no, I needed to give them form. At a certain point, now this is also crazy, and I don't know if established novelists have this experience, I actually thought my characters were real. I was supporting Carmelo, whom of all the characters, I liked Carmelo the most because he was the most cowardly. He never really took a chance. And I felt like I gave him life, and I gave him life to talk to him. This is wacky. I know this is wacky. This is not. I guess so. Thank you for the question, though.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm wondering about the editing and how you feel about the edited book as compared to the 500-page book.
Oh, it was very painful. That's a great question. It was very painful to get rid of my 240 pages because I had great stories there. They were fabulous stories. And I knew it was just too much. And I also was taking a chance on places that I didn't know. I had characters running around in Naples in 1943. I've been in Naples for a total of 8 days of my entire life. I had no business doing that. And I had, I needed to edit it out, and I needed to get rid of the backstory and make those characters work on their own, you know? Because I really loved telling the stories that I had learned. And I needed to have the characters walk through their adventures, and the editing took place there, you know?
Thank you. I haven't read it yet, Francine,
Okay.
but I will. But I did have a question about the familial narrative and your process in recuperating certain oral narratives, and then the juxtaposition with the historical. And you know, it's interesting to me that you have dual narrators. One is female, I take it, and one is male, and so and they're siblings, so there's a complicated sibling relationship. So the question of, you know, the subtext of the gendering of the voices and the kinship narrative, which is scattered across the Atlantic. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the questioning of the gendering of the kinship narrative as well.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question, and I didn't think about it as much until I finished round one, and I realized these are powerful women who walked into the narrative, and they became stronger as I was writing about it. So that was good, right? But about the familial narrative, I wanted this to be a story about kinship and blood and alignments that were beyond bloodlines, right? And this is very much a novel about friendships in the end, even though the family line holds through. I need to say one thing as a disclaimer. In my real family, whatever that is, I don't think we have art forgers. I don't think we have child molesters. And I mean, this was a pretty crummy bunch that I put together. But they have nothing to do with real life. But I did want to acknowledge the limits of the family bonding. And in fact, I won't tell you about I can't talk about the end of the novel. I'm not supposed to do that, but thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. It's an important question.
Thank you, and thanks for not spoiling the novel, because, you know, I have a comment and a question about the wacky characters. I mean, we all know that just because something doesn't exist doesn't mean it's not real, right? So whatever. But the question has to do with language, right? I imagine these characters would be experiencing life through Italian, through Spanish, and yet you're writing them, I'm assuming, through English. So how is the decision? How can we feel this through the text? That question.
Thank you so much for that question, because did somebody prompt you to ask? I didn't. But I want, because everything was based on supplementary knowledge, additions, I made the language be central to the project of writing. In fact, Silvio, the artist, stutters, Billy Budd. But anyway, he stutters from page 30 in this novel, and he overcomes it. But he has trouble expressing himself, and in moments of crisis, he regresses. The other characters are speaking to each other. Eugenia goes to Naples, and they listen to the Southern Italian dialects from these villages of 2,000 people, and they say, you have to clean up your act. You just cannot speak like this. So there's a scene where they're speaking, where she's saying a word in dialect and someone's correcting her and saying it in standard Italian. That's back and forth. I needed to make that palpable, and I needed to have a physical presence of that language. And then, as I think I said at the beginning, Eugenia is told that even standard Italian is not good enough for this family, and she has to speak French if she wants to eat. She said, let's eat. Forget this thing about the French. I can't tell. And this goes on. And in New York, it goes on as well. And it goes on in Buenos Aires. And there's kind of a tutti frutti. And I thought, if you don't know it, too bad. If you, as the reader, can't get it, struggle. And Carmelo works in a carnival in New York where this comes to surface again. And he's telling jokes, bilingual jokes. And I translated them, but then at a certain point I didn't. And I have, the narrator says, and the carnival master understood very little, and he just scratched his head. And I was thinking, if you don't get it, it's okay, you can move on. But I wanted to emphasize the materiality of language, and have it go and make us see it, touch it, feel it. But thank you for the question. I think there's probably a lot more to say about that. Oh,
so
no.
you've spent a whole life reading novels, some in translation, but an awful lot in the original, in English, in Italian, and in Spanish. At any point while you were writing, beginning or in the middle, near the end, were you conscious of matters of style, of people you'd read, hearing it, wanting to work with it, wanting to run away from sounding like people you know, people you've written about, people you've yelled at, people who've been dead for a long time but have influenced you in any of those three languages? Thanks.
Oh, that is a noble question, but it's also a dirty question, because in a book about forgers and copiers, the biggest fake is me. Francine is the biggest fake, because I heard as I was typing, I said, oh my goodness, he said that. I said, that's the strategy of Ricardo Piglia. He was always deferring. Or I found myself writing out many years later, not as he faced the firing squad, but it was definitely, I figured these were tricks that helped condense the time sequences. And I heard novelists, they were always going through my head. And I couldn't get rid of the copying. There's a terrible scene, and Mia and Barbara will probably send me to hell and back when they read this, is there was a very famous Italian novel published in the 40s called Carne, where there's a story, it's a World War II story in which they take, and I'll spare you, I copied the scene, but I put it in the footnote, okay? And I changed it. And I wanted to make the reader very aware of the fact that I was stealing as much as the characters were stealing. I mean, I don't know, I may have a copyright problem, but I don't think so. I made sure everything was at least 100 years old. Not God, but in any event, yeah, it was and is an issue. Thank you for asking that terrible question.
Hey, Francine, thank you. This was so great.
Goodness. Hi,
I feel a little strange about asking this question, but the novel it's an historical novel in many ways, and it's also a novel that is engaged with very difficult moments of history in different places. And perhaps characteristically, when you described the death of one of your characters during the period of the dictatorship in Argentina, you said, I really didn't want to bring that history into the kitsch that is my novel. But I want to press you on, not press you, I want to invite you to speak more about your relationship to these difficult histories in writing the novel. And, you know, I mean, I think that I hear what you're saying about a certain discomfort, perhaps, in thinking of your novel as representing those moments and those histories and the people who experience them. But I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you've spoken at different moments today about your relationship to different archival sources and the affective charge of those relationships. And obviously, you know, you're someone who has thought very deeply about what it means to be in a kind of custodial relationship to history. So I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about that aspect of the project for you.
It's very difficult because you don't want to thank you, Carl, for the question. You know, I didn't want to dishonor serious events in 20th century that had taken place in the 20th century. And for those of us who know about Argentina, to write about the disappeared in a novel is really, I felt very unscrupulous. I mean, I think I corrected it and I didn't get too deep into detail about Silvio's disappearance, but I had different responses to that, by the way. People who knew very little about Argentina thought it was great to put that there. And Natalia said, don't put that in there. It's going to sound awful. And I have Natalia's words in my head. I said, but I have to have Silvio end this way. But these are ethical issues, it seems to me. I struggled with other things, you know, who am I to be writing about World War II, right? I mean, and the effects of the Second World War. I felt more comfortable. I should have written a novel about immigrants in New York, and that wasn't sufficient. It was not adequate. I needed to put these characters, I needed to move them. I needed to show their discomfort, and I needed to give them form in different places. But if there is an ethical discomfort that I felt, and I still sort of feel about that. So that's why I'm very happy to have you folks involved in this a little bit with me. I probably should have had this conversation with you before I finished it, but okay. Thank you. Oh.
Maybe just a simple question, but why were you called to tell this story? Of all the possibilities, and your work in the 19th century as well, why, what were you trying to, was there something you were trying to work out in telling the story?
Yes, it's legit. I felt my response to, my need to do this was, I could not become an Italian scholar, right? I'm looking at Barbara. No, I couldn't do that at this stage of the game. I don't know enough. But I thought there were certain things that I knew that could work here. And there were certain things that I could learn that I could fold into the novel. And there were certain things that I know from my many years as a Latin Americanist. I know how to read newspapers. I know how to read magazines. I know how a not very well-educated public reads the newspapers. They go to the ads. I had my characters going to the ads. I loved all of that. I loved this sounds crazy, one of my high points was finding, I know a lot about Argentine anarchism, and I discovered in the world of the copy that La Questione Sociale, which is an Italian anarchist journal that was published in Argentina and in Italy and in New Jersey, was all about copying. The same articles that showed up in the Argentine version showed up in the New Jersey version of this. And I loved that kind of research, and I love to think about it, that even if people were manifesting a great political enthusiasm, they were borrowing and cutting and pasting. And in fact, one of the characters says, we can't pay you, but you can cut and paste because we can't afford the journalist, do whatever you need to do. And that was really, in fact, that's how these things were put together. What moved, I needed to tell something about Italy. I needed to tell this kind of story. No, I don't know. I was retired, I could tell. Charo.
Thank you, Francine. And I, as an Argentine, I'm very glad that you wrote about Argentina and the way you put it in there. But my question goes, like, before you were talking about how, for instance, you thought your mom was the explicator of these letters. And then you came to learn all these new things about your family. And I am wondering what happened with the historical part of the novel. If by writing this story, you changed the way you thought about historical events.
I don't know if I changed how I thought about historical events. I thought that small families were always on the margins of these big events. No, we always think that we're going to change the world, and we certainly, and no, it doesn't really happen like that. I don't think I changed my thinking about historical events, but I sort of reminded myself that our place is really subordinate to these great events. It's very rare that we're in the center of history, although we'd like to believe it. Anyway.
So I think this is a good place to stop, and we can thank Francine for a wonderful conversation.